The Viscount's verdict. In the hallowed silence of the royal courts of justice, where the ghosts of 1,000 judgments lingered in the dust motes dancing in the high-arched windows, Julian Thorborne, Viscount Ashworth, was a god. He was a god of wigs and gavels, of precedent and statute. At 34, he was the youngest judge to sit on the King's Bench, a position earned not through the privilege of his title, but through a mind so piercingly sharp, so rigorously fair, that even the most seasoned barristers approached his courtroom with a tremor in their voices. His reputation was built on an unwavering commitment to the letter of the law. He was not known for mercy, but for meticulousness. He did not dispense justice. He identified it, cold and immutable, from the facts presented. It was said that Lord Ashworth could hear a lie in the catch of a man's breath and see guilt in the too perfect posture of a defendant. He was a man of logic, of order, and of profound solitude. His world was a fortress of books and briefs, a world he controlled absolutely. That fortress was about to be breached. It began with a name on a piece of parchment, a request from the Lord Chancellor's office for the placement of a new junior clerk. The name was Mr. Elias Thorne. Ashworth scanned the accompanying letter of recommendation, which spoke of a brilliant legal mind from Oxford, a scholar of exceptional promise. He initialed the document without a second thought. Clerks came and went, pale, ambitious young men who would spend a year absorbing his methods before vanishing into the lucrative world of barristers' chambers. They were interchangeable. Elias Thorne was not. The morning he arrived, Ashworth was at his desk, a fortress of stacked leather-bound volumes. He heard the soft knock, the hesitant opening of the heavy oak door. "Enter," he said, without looking up. "My lord." The voice was low, carefully modulated, but it carried a resonance that sliced through the silence of the room. It was a voice that did not belong in the dusty, masculine world of the law. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. His quill froze mid-stroke, a blot of ink spreading on the page like a dark stain. He knew that voice. He looked up. Standing before him was a young man. Slight of build, dressed in the sombre, ill-fitting black suit of a clerk. A mop of dark curls was tamed as best as possible, and large, round spectacles dominated a pale, fine-boned face. But it was the eyes behind those spectacles that held him, large, expressive, the colour of warm sherry. They were the eyes of the only woman he had ever loved. For a suspended moment, the world contracted to just the two of them. He saw the faint tremor in the hand that held a leather satchel. He saw the slight, defiant tilt of her chin. It was Arabelle Northam. The name he had spent 7 years trying to forget crashed over him like a wave of ice water. The last time he had seen those eyes, they were filled with tears on a rain-swept dock in Portsmouth, as a naval frigate carried her and her disgraced family into exile. The last time he had heard that voice, it was a whisper against his lips, a promise of forever that had been shattered by the cold hand of the law. He, a newly appointed judge, had presided over the trial that destroyed her family. He had found her father, Sir Geoffrey Northam, guilty of high treason. "My lord," the figure repeated, a flicker of something. Was it fear? Defiance, crossing its face? "I am your new clerk, Elias Thorne." The name was a clumsy masquerade, a thin veil over the truth. Elias, a masculine version of her own. Thorne, a constant reminder of the pain she had come to inflict. Ashworth's mind, trained to process information with inhuman speed, raced through a cascade of implications. What was she doing here? How had she orchestrated this? What madness had compelled her to walk back into the very heart of the world that had condemned her? His duty was clear. He should expose her. A woman impersonating a man to gain access to a judge's private chambers was a scandal of the highest order. It was a crime. It was an affront to the court. It was an affront to him. But he didn't. He was a man who lived by the law, yet in that single, shattering moment, something older, something deeper than the law, held him captive. It was the ghost of the man he had been before the Viscount's coronet, before the judge's robes, the young, besotted Julian who had promised her the world. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a hollow echo of its usual authority. "Your reputation precedes you. Let us hope you are worthy of it." A flicker of relief, so brief he might have imagined it, passed through her eyes. "I shall endeavour to be, my lord." And so began the most dangerous game of his life. Arabelle Northam had not returned to London by chance. The previous 7 years had been a crucible. From the gilded cages of the English aristocracy, she had been thrust into the gritty reality of a colonial outpost in Nova Scotia. Her father, Sir Geoffrey, broken in body and spirit by his imprisonment and the subsequent voyage, had become a shadow of the man he once was. He spent his days staring at the grey Atlantic, a silent testament to a terrible injustice. Her mother had died of a broken heart within 2 years, unable to bear the shame and the isolation. It was in that bleak landscape that Arabelle's grief hardened into a cold, burning purpose. Her father was innocent. She knew it with a certainty that was the very core of her being. The evidence presented at his trial, a ciphered letter allegedly proving he was selling naval secrets to the French, was a lie. But it was a lie so expertly crafted, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of circumstantial evidence, that it had convinced a jury, it had convinced Julian. And that was the wound that festered deepest. Julian. The man who had held her hand and sworn to love her forever was the same man who had donned a horsehair wig and with a dispassionate voice sent her father to rot. He hadn't just believed the lie. He had been the instrument of its permanence. His verdict was the gavel blow that had shattered her life. Her father's only legacy, besides his ruined name, was a set of papers he had managed to hide before his arrest. They were cryptic notes, names, dates, and references to a man he only identified as the Viper. Sir Geoffrey believed this man, a trusted contact in the Admiralty, had been the true traitor, framing him to cover his own tracks. The proof, her father insisted, was hidden somewhere in London, in the records of the trial itself. The official transcripts, the evidence logs, the witness testimonies, somewhere in that mountain of paper was the key to unravelling the Viper's lie. To find it, she needed access, and the only place those records existed in their complete, unexpurgated form was in the chambers of the presiding judge, Julian Thorborne, Viscount Ashworth. The plan was audacious, born of desperation and a brilliant, analytical mind that rivaled Julian's own. Her father had taught her the law as a child, reading Blackstone to her instead of fairy tales. She had a natural gift for it. Disguising herself as a man was the only way. She had studied masculine mannerisms, lowered her pitch, bound her figure, and with the help of a loyal former servant, forged the necessary credentials. The Mr. Elias Thorne, who arrived at the Royal Courts of Justice, was a construct of pure will, a ghost of her former self, haunting the halls of her own destruction. Working for Julian was a torture she had not fully anticipated. Every day was a tightrope walk over an abyss of discovery. She would enter his chambers each morning, her heart hammering against her ribs, and find him already at work, his dark head bent over some document, the early light carving his features into a familiar, beloved mask. He was older now. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by a chiselled severity. There were threads of grey at his temples, lines of thought etched between his brows. He was still impossibly handsome, and that was the cruelest trick of all. He treated her with a cold, impeccable professionalism. "Mr. Thorne, the brief on Rex versus Hollingsworth, if you please." "Mr. Thorne, your summation of the precedents was adequate." Adequate. From him, it was a high compliment. He never slipped, never called her by her name, never acknowledged the chasm of history that lay between them. But she would catch him sometimes, staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze would be intense, unreadable, tracing the line of her jaw, the way her fingers moved across a page. In those moments, the air in the room would thicken, and the careful charade felt as fragile as spun glass. For Julian, it was a waking dream and a waking nightmare. He watched her work, marveling at the mind he had so admired in their youth. She dissected complex legal arguments with a clarity that surpassed any clerk he had ever had. Her opinions were sharp, insightful, and often challenged his own initial thoughts. He found himself, for the first time in years, actually discussing the law with someone, debating fine points not as a master with a pupil, but as an equal. One afternoon, they were working late on a particularly intricate case involving maritime law. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He was explaining a point about salvage rights, and she interjected with a nuanced interpretation of a 17th century admiralty ruling. He stopped mid-sentence, his quill hovering in the air. "You have a remarkable command of the obscure, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up from the document she was reading. My father believed that to understand the present, one must first understand the foundations upon which it is built. The old cases hold the keys to the new." He knew she was speaking of Sir Geoffrey. A pang of something, guilt, regret, longing, pierced his carefully constructed armour. "A wise man," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She finally looked up, and for a fleeting second, the mask of Elias Thorne slipped. He saw the raw emotion in her eyes, the accusation, the pain. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the clerk's bland deference. "Indeed, my lord." He wanted to reach across the desk and take her hand. He wanted to explain, to tell her that the trial had haunted him, that he had reviewed the documents 100 times, searching for a flaw, a doubt. He wanted to ask her why she was here, to beg her to trust him. But he was a viscount, a judge. He was a prisoner of his own position. To acknowledge her was to destroy her. To expose her was to condemn her. His only choice was to maintain the silence, to watch, and to wait. The strain began to tell on them both. For Arabelle, the search was proving fruitless. The trial records were voluminous, but she could only steal moments to examine them when Julian was in court or at meetings. She found the official transcripts, the witness statements, the damning ciphered letter. But it all looked exactly as she remembered. There was no obvious flaw, no hidden document, no clue as to the Viper's identity. Her father's cryptic notes mentioned a name, a Lieutenant Commander Armitage, who had been the key witness for the prosecution. He had been the one to discover the letter and identify Sir Geoffrey's handwriting. Perhaps the answer lay with him. Her frustration was mounting, and with it, the risk of discovery. One evening, searching for a specific folio, she went too far. She was in the small private archive attached to Julian's chambers, a room he had strictly forbidden her to enter alone. She was hunched over a box of old files, a single candle her only light, when she heard the soft click of the door behind her. She spun around. Julian stood in the doorway, his face a mask of stone. He was in his shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, looking more like the young man she remembered than the stern judge he had become. He held a branch of candles, their light illuminating her guilty start. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you are in a part of my chambers that is off limits." She straightened up, her heart pounding. I was looking for the Erskine files, my lord. I thought they might be misfiled in here. I apologize for the overstep." He walked slowly into the room, his eyes not on the boxes, but on her face. He set the candles down on a table. "The Erskine files are, and always have been, in the main cabinet, third drawer from the top. You know this, you organize them yourself." The trap was sprung. She had no answer. She stood there, frozen, the embodiment of guilt. He took a step closer. "Why are you here, Arabelle?" The sound of her real name, spoken in his deep, resonant voice, after 7 years of silence, was like a key turning in a lock. It unlocked the fear, the anger, the grief she had kept bottled up for so long. The persona of Elias Thorne crumbled, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fire he remembered all too well. "You know why I'm here, Julian. You know what you did." "I did my duty," he said, the old defense rising automatically to his lips. "Your duty?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Your duty was to find the truth. My father was innocent and you condemned him. You took my family, my future, my life, and you crushed them under the heel of your precious, infallible law." The accusation hung in the air between them, a tangible force. Julian flinched as if she had struck him. The mask of the judge shattered, revealing the man beneath, a man haunted by the very same questions. "Do you think I don't know that?" he said, his voice ragged with an emotion she had never heard from the bench. "Do you think there has been a single day since that trial that I have not reviewed the evidence? That I have not lain awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if I made a mistake?" "Then you know you did," she whispered, her anger deflating into a profound weariness. "I know the evidence was compelling," he said, his own voice dropping. The letter was in his hand. The witness, Armitage, was credible. The cipher was broken and it detailed fleet movements that were later acted upon by the French. What else could I have done? "Looked deeper," she cried. "Listen to my father. He told you he was being set up. He told you about the Viper." Julian frowned. "The Viper? What are you talking about?" It was the first sign of true ignorance she had seen from him. He didn't know. Her father's allegations had never made it into the official record. They had been dismissed as the desperate ravings of a guilty man. She saw her chance. If she could convince Julian, if she could make him see, then maybe there was a path forward. "My father kept notes," she began, her voice low and urgent. "He was investigating a leak in the Admiralty. He had identified a man, a trusted official, who he believed was the real traitor. He called him the Viper. The night before his arrest, he gave me a set of papers and told me to hide them. He said if anything happened to him, the proof was in those papers." "Proof of what?" "Of the Viper's access to the information, of his meetings with known French agents, of his motive. The witness, Armitage. My father suspected he was the Viper's puppet, that he planted the letter." Julian listened, his legal mind immediately engaging. It was a defense, a narrative, but it was one that had never been presented. Why was this not brought up at trial? Why did your father not testify to this? Because his own barrister, a man appointed by the court, advised him against it. He said it was hearsay, that without the papers, it would sound like a fantastical excuse. And they had taken his papers, Julian. They were seized as evidence, and the Viper's name wasn't in them. It was in the ones he had hidden with me, the ones they never found. The pieces began to click together in Julian's mind. The barrister, the convenient evidence, the single, unimpeachable witness, the overall haste of the trial. It had all seemed so clean, so perfectly damning, too perfect. "What is the name?" he asked, his voice now the calm, focused tone of an investigator, not a judge. "The name of the Viper. Did your father tell you?" Arabelle hesitated. This was the moment of truth. He had a name, but he wasn't certain. His notes point to a man, but the final proof, he said it was in the original letter. The one presented at trial wasn't the original. It was a copy. The original, he believed, had annotations in the margin, notes made by the Viper himself when he forged it, that would prove its falsity. He thought Armitage must have kept it, as insurance. Julian stared at her, the implications dawning on him with terrifying clarity. The original exhibit. If it still existed, and if it contained what she claimed, It would not only exonerate Sir Geoffrey, it would destroy the credibility of the court, of the Admiralty, and of him. It would be the biggest scandal in a generation. You're asking me to believe that an officer of the Crown, a man I found credible on the stand, perjured himself and fabricated evidence, Julian said slowly. I'm asking you to look, Arabelle pleaded, stepping closer to him. I'm asking you to do what you should have done 7 years ago. Not as a judge, Julian, as the man I once loved. Look for the truth. The words hung between them. The man I once loved. It was a past tense that felt like a present wound. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in 7 years. He saw not a ghost, not a memory, but a woman of fierce courage and unwavering love for her father. A woman who had risked everything on a desperate, insane plan. A woman he had never stopped loving, though he had buried it so deep he thought it was dead. He made a decision that would shatter every principle he had built his life upon. He chose her over the law. Armitage, he said. He's still in London. He was promoted after the trial. He's now a captain, working in the Admiralty archives. Arabelle's eyes widened with a flicker of desperate hope. Can you get to him? No, Julian said, a grim determination settling on his features. But we can. Together. The investigation that followed was a dangerous dance. By day, Julian was the stern Viscount Ashworth, presiding over his court with his usual meticulousness, while Mr. Thorne sat in the corner taking notes. By night, they were conspirators. Julian used his position and his knowledge of the legal and social world to open doors. He sent Arabelle, as his clerk, to the Admiralty archives on pretexts, allowing her to search for any record of Armitage's old cases. He discreetly made inquiries among old contacts, piecing together Armitage's history, his associations, his spending habits. What they found was telling. Armitage, a man of modest means, had purchased a small estate in Kent shortly after the Northam trial. His wife now wore jewels that seemed far beyond a captain's pay. The trail led them to a disreputable part of London, to a gambling hell where Armitage was known to lose heavily. Julian, abandoning his title for a night, donned plain clothes and accompanied Arabelle to observe him. They saw him lose a fortune at cards, and then later that evening meet with a known moneylender. He's desperate, Julian murmured, as they watched from the shadows of a hackney cab. He's living beyond his means, and his luck is turning. It's the insurance, Arabelle whispered, her eyes fixed on the nervous captain. He's been living off the Viper's payments, but now they've probably stopped. He might try to sell the letter. It was a race. If Armitage panicked and destroyed the evidence, or sold it to someone who would bury it forever, they would lose their only chance. Their chance came at a society ball, one of the last of the season. Julian, in his full Viscount's regalia, was a required attendee. Arabelle, once again in her male clerk's attire, was there as his aide, a common enough practice. Julian spotted Armitage across the crowded ballroom, trying to blend in with the glittering throng, but looking as nervous as a cat in a kennel. Stay close, Julian murmured to Arabelle. I'm going to draw him out. He approached Armitage with a mask of casual affability. Captain Armitage, a pleasure to see you again. I don't believe we've spoken since the Northam trial. Armitage went pale. Lord Ashworth. No, sir. A long time ago. A pivotal case, Julian continued, his voice light, but his eyes sharp. One of my first. It made quite a mark on my career. I was reviewing some of the old evidence the other day for a treatise I'm writing, and I noticed the original letter wasn't in the file. Only the copy admitted into evidence. A minor administrative curiosity, I'm sure. The blood drained entirely from Armitage's face. The original? I have no idea, my lord. It would have been logged, I'm sure. Perhaps it was misfiled. My clerk, Mr. Thorne, has a remarkable talent for finding lost things. He'd be happy to assist you in searching your own records if you'd like, to ensure the court's archives are complete, of course. He gestured, and Arabelle stepped forward. Armitage looked at the slight, bespectacled figure, seeing only a harmless clerk. Sweat beaded on his brow. That won't be necessary, my lord. I'm sure it's nothing. I insist, Julian said, his voice hardening with the authority of the bench. It's a matter of legal precision. Mr. Thorne will call on you at your office tomorrow morning. Good evening, Captain. They had him, cornered and terrified. The next morning, Arabelle, armed with Julian's authority and her own sharp intellect, went to Armitage's office. She didn't have to search for long. Within an hour, she was back in Julian's chambers, her hands trembling as she placed a yellowed piece of paper on his desk. It was the original letter, and in the margin, in a tiny, crabbed hand, were annotations. They weren't part of the cipher, they were notes in plain English. A just cipher to match Northam's style. Good. His fate is sealed. And at the bottom, a small, distinct signature, a crude drawing of a serpent. It was the Viper's signature. A confession, written right on the evidence. Armitage hadn't just kept it as insurance, he had kept it as a trophy, never imagining anyone would think to look for it. Arabelle stared at the paper, tears streaming silently down her face. Proof. After 7 years, here it was. Julian looked from the letter to her. The evidence was irrefutable. The trial had been a sham. The verdict was a lie. He had been the instrument of a terrible injustice. Arabelle, he began, his voice thick with remorse. I don't know what to say. I was so certain. I was so arrogant. I believed in the system so completely, I couldn't see its corruption. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. You're helping me now, Julian. That's what matters. No, he said, standing and coming around the desk. What matters is that I have the power to put it right. Not as a judge presiding over a new trial, but as a man with a name, a title, and a voice that will be heard. I will take this to the Home Secretary myself. I will demand a full pardon for your father and a public inquiry. The process was swift. Once the wheels of power were turned by a man of Julian's standing, the evidence was so damning that a cover-up was impossible. Captain Armitage was arrested and, facing the hangman's noose, confessed everything, naming the Viper, a now deceased senior Admiralty official, as the mastermind. The news of Sir Geoffrey Northam's innocence and the gross miscarriage of justice exploded across London, toppling reputations and shaking the very foundations of the legal establishment. For Julian, it meant the end of his career as he knew it. He submitted his resignation from the bench to the Lord Chancellor the day after Armitage's confession was made public. It was an unprecedented act, a judge admitting that his own verdict had been a catastrophic error. A man who cannot be certain of the truth has no right to dispense justice, he wrote in his letter of resignation. I must first learn to see clearly before I can presume to judge others. He was a Viscount still, but he was no longer a god. He was just a man. The final scene takes place a month later at a small private dock in Greenwich. A clean, well-appointed ship was preparing to sail for Nova Scotia to bring Sir Geoffrey Northam home to a hero's welcome and a restored name. Arabelle stood on the dock, no longer in the guise of Elias Thorne. She wore a simple but elegant travelling dress, the wind catching at her hair. She was watching the ship, a future she had fought for finally within reach. She heard footsteps on the wooden planks behind her and turned. Julian stood there, hatless, his greatcoat billowing in the wind. He looked different. The stern, unapproachable lines of his face had softened. He looked younger, more like the man she had once known. I thought I might find you here, he said. She offered a small, sad smile. I wanted to see it. The ship that will bring him back. It feels like a dream. It's not a dream, he said, moving to stand beside her. It's justice. Long overdue. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sailors prepare the vessel. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Without your court?" He let out a long breath. "I don't know. Perhaps I'll open a small practice, represent the kind of people the system usually tramples, or maybe I'll just sit in the country and think about everything I got wrong." He turned to face her fully. "But there's one thing I want to ask you, Arabelle. One thing I need to know." She met his gaze, her sherry-coloured eyes unreadable. "What?" "I was a fool," he said, his voice low and intense. "A blind, arrogant fool. I chose the law over you. I chose certainty over love, and I have regretted it every single day for 7 years. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm asking, is there any part of the woman I loved that could ever learn to love the man I am now?" The wind whipped between them, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the cries of gulls. Arabelle looked at him, this man who had shattered her world and then risked everything to help her rebuild it. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the humility that had replaced his old pride, the love that he had never been able to hide, even behind the mask of the judge. She thought of her father, coming home. She thought of her mother, who had died in exile. She thought of the long, lonely years. And she thought of Julian sitting with her late at night, his head bent over the same documents, a partner in her quest for truth. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "I don't know, Julian," she whispered honestly. "The girl I was died a long time ago, on a ship just like that one. But the woman I became, she might be willing to find out." A smile, the first genuine smile of pure joy she had ever seen on his face, transformed him. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Then let's go and get your father," he said. "Together." He offered her his arm. She looked from his face to the ship, to the future that was sailing towards them. She slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, and they stood there, two people who had lost everything and found each other again, watching the horizon, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap